why don't you describe the philosophy of the fourth turning, and then we can talk about, maybe you can help me think through my questions about it.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So it's a book written in the late 90s by Neil Howe and Bill Strauss, around the same time, The Sovereign Individual. And the thesis is essentially that society over time does not advance linearly. Instead, it advances in these predictable cycles. And ancient man observed all kinds of cycles. Biology is full of them, like the moon going around is the month, and the sun. Us going around the sun is a year, carbon water cycle, etc. We also have all these human financial cycles like a Ray Dalio long-term credit cycle, sovereign individual logical violence cycles. And so I'm pretty bought into the cycle thing. And then these authors say every 90 years, we essentially go through a crisis period, which they call a fourth turning. And they describe it as sort of we build all these institutions, over time they decay, things get bad, and then humanity goes, wait, all our institutions suck, and we might actually want them because they're helpful for society. So humanity rallies together, we rebuild all the social, political, economic infrastructure. And it typically requires a really strong catalyst in order to motivate all this big, wide sweeping change. And throughout history, all previous fourth turnings in the last 500 years climax with war. So the previous fourth turning involved 1929 to 1945. So you've got World War II there. Prior than that, you have the Civil War. The prior one, you had the American Revolution, etc. And so that's sort of like the high level. And the thesis is based on studying demographics and in these generational cycles. And so the sort of the shortest way to summarize it is history creates generations, and then generations create history. And what I mean by that is, let's say we're millennials, we're all born at the same time. And the time we're born, roughly, all imprints the same sort of like influence on us. So we become this well-defined generation based on our circumstance. Then we grow up, and now we're this well-defined generation that's old enough, and we start pushing back on history. And so, yeah, history create generation, generation create history. And the thesis is that the constellation of these different archetypal generations, so there's like hero, artist, nomad, etc., prophet, depending on what age these people are at, determines the mood. And that overall mood determines how society responds to catalysts. And yeah, I guess my essay is trying to place us in deep history and in terms of this cyclical view, and then also make a comment on the current zeitgeist and what I foresee happening in the next 10 years.
So one of the things that stuck with me after reading The Fourth Turning, and I don't know whether or not this is actually from The Fourth Turning, but I saw this or something and it stuck with me. It was that cycle of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, where it fits perfectly with that fourth turning cycle. And it's it definitely seems like that's happening and has continued to happen throughout history. And we definitely seem to be on the precipice of a fourth turning, or either entered into a fourth turning, with all of the division and everything that's happened, exacerbated by social media algorithms in the last 4 years. The truth itself is kind of in question. There's an epistemic crisis happening where people just don't know what is true, and then it makes people sort into tribes much faster. And tribalism is much worse than it was when I was growing up, it feels like. But now it's not just tribalism like you're talking about it with your friends. It's like almost like a weird virus has infected your mind when you go on the internet, and these algorithms that are tuned to make you engage actually ruin your critical thinking skills, because it's just showing you stuff that you're going to react to. And that's actually shown up in our politics and everything. It's like going off into the real world. It's not just people being upset online, it's people actually saying and doing things that they wouldn't unless it was like a fourth turning. So it definitely does feel like we've kind of entered into a fourth turning. Do you think that it's going to actually culminate into war, or do you think it's just going to culminate into like something else?
Yeah, good question. So I believe that we are firmly in the middle of the fourth turning right now. And I'll explain kind of how that looks. But first, hard times create strong men create good times. So hard times create strong men. That's where we are right now. And that's what the fourth turning is it's a hard transition, and during that process the hero archetype steps up, we consolidate power, we make hard choices, and we essentially fix the world and then redo all our institutions. Then in the first turning, the next
Do you
stage.
think we're there though? It doesn't feel like we're quite there yet to me. Like things could get a lot worse than they are right now. For a lot of people, they're in financial shit. Like they've got no money and they're in debt up to their necks and things suck. But if you think about previous cycles where they actually had to deal with the Black Plague or the Civil War, and plus they didn't even have power, they didn't even have technology to help them through this. They could go dying, taking a dump out in the woods. They could get eaten by a bear or something like that. It doesn't really feel like we're in hard times, even though financially it feels hard for most of the world.
Yeah, that's fair. So what I would say is a current fourth turning started in '08, and that sort of made a major shift between times before and after, and it's led to a resurgence of populism and accelerated increase of income inequality. So the divide is getting much worse, much faster from '08. And 2020, I would say, is sort of the on-ramp to the climax. I agree, we
Mm.
have not hit the climax yet, and I don't know what that is. I think it's hard to say.
I think we're in weak men create hard times. I think that's where we are right now. We've been so spoiled by technology and excess and all the money that's been printed that everybody seems weak. And this is why I'm thinking my problem with it, with the concept, is because I feel like we're in the weak men create hard times cycle, which is maybe the beginning of the fourth turning. But other people in other countries are firmly in that, like, hard times create strong men. Like, if you think of the developing worlds like Africa and India and China, the cycle that they're in is not the same cycle that we're in. Like the people that were growing up in Africa with barely any power, and like the younger generation, the millennial generation in Africa is much bigger than our millennial generation here, because most of the old people have died off because they don't have the technology to keep them alive. And you know they're accelerating to the point where they may, like, Nigeria might be the tech capital of the world in 10 or 20 years. And these are the strong men. Like they've had to fight for everything they've got. The people that grew up with having to, like, haggle and negotiate, and we haven't had to do that. Everything's been handed to us. We've just had technology give us everything. But there's a whole, like, billion people in the world that are the young generation that have had foundationally to fight for everything they've had. And that's a strong generation, where I feel like here in the West we're just a weak generation that is entering into, oh, shit's about to get real. We could see a civil war, we could see a global depression, and our generation over here in the West wouldn't handle it as good as the Chinese millennials and the African millennials and the Indian millennials, because they've been struggling for everything they got all their whole lives.
Yeah, I kind of see what you're saying. The thesis from the author's perspective is in the West. It's firmly based in America, and before America left the UK. And so, but you bring up an interesting point. Like, is the fourth turning synced up with other nations around the world? And I think that this is the first time where we can say probably yes. We're seeing populism rise all over the US, or sorry, all over the world. Places like the Philippines, France, Venezuela, all over the place. And so I think that we are synced
Bolivia.
up. Bolivia, I
Yeah.
think we are synced up here, which could mean a more volatile period. But to go back to what you said about, you think that we're not in the hard times. So the unraveling, which is the third turning, I believe that is weak men create hard times. And what they're doing, like, third turning is essentially the mid 80s up to '08. And that's a period where the demand for order is extremely low and the supply of order is extremely low. It's sort of like the getting's good. Nobody cares. It's also the roaring 20s. We sort of know something's wrong, but we're not affected by it yet. And so we just deregulate. We just push our gas pedal on the economic stuff. We have all kinds of crime and problems. And then all of a sudden it starts to unravel, in a sense that, like, society starts to fracture. That's '08. And then we go, oh crap, like, we've been excessive and we need to do something about it. And so I believe that we firmly are in the hard times, but where we're sitting, we're going to feel it the least. Right. I don't think there's any way to disagree with that. We're going to feel it by far the least. But I foresee, we have another 9 years or so until we get out of the fourth turning. And a lot can happen in 9 years. Think about the difference between 1938 and 1947, right? You're in the 38 is pre-World War II. We're like trying to come out of the Great Depression. We just did the New Deal. We built highways and we're doing all this stuff. And then all of a sudden we go to World War II and everything changes. And now in 1945, we've got Bretton Woods, the World Bank, NATO, IMF, unemployment insurance, pensions, Social Security. All that stuff was created in that 9 years. And so, or even less than 9 years. So I think we're sort of on the precipice for the big climax. And the millennials, the hero journey, we're essentially being called to arms here in this period of time to go fix the thing. And in terms of what's the climax, it could be war, like as in US fights China or something. I don't think so, though. I think the most likely options are, I thought it could have been COVID. In March, I was like, this is going to be the thing. Society is going to rally around the virus. We're going to fight it and we're going to win. But I think the virus actually is not as bad as we thought. And it's causing all kinds of political drama around it. And it's actually tearing us apart worse. And so I think the most likely outcome is a civil war, a second civil war in America. And I don't mean like a clearly defined North versus South. It won't be anything like that. It will be more of this confusing quagmire. You don't know who's on what team. It's kind of like, you have the separatists and you have the super left-leaning folks. The government's cracking down. There's weird militias here, disruption there. I think it's mostly that. Like, it's sort of a class struggle, and mostly due to the fact that income inequality is so bad, and that needs to be fixed. And there's many reasons for that, but that's kind of how I'm seeing it.